Hi, I'm Misha Ketchell, editor of The Conversation. For democracy to work, people need to be well informed. That's why we work with academic experts to share their research and explain issues in the news. Everything we do is free to republish, but we need your support. Please donate to The Conversation by going to donate.theconversation.com or following the link in the show notes.
From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
The federal coalition has fallen apart. The Liberals are in crisis, with Andrew Hastie and Angus Taylor circling Susan Lee, whose leadership appears terminal. Yet only a couple of weeks ago, the Albanese government was the side of politics that had its back against the wall, after extensive criticism of its handling of the aftermath of the Bondi massacre. The trigger for the dramatic turnaround was the government's legislation in the wake of Bondi to tighten restrictions on gun ownership and to take further measures against hate speech and organisations that promote hate. Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Jonno Duniam, was in the middle of the events that turned into a crisis for the opposition. He's a senator from Tasmania and a key member of the Liberal Party's Conservative faction. He joins us today to talk about what happened and what's to come for the Liberals. Jonno Duniam, without going into all the ins and outs of what happened between the Liberals and the Nationals, how could consideration of legislation that addresses hate that was brought forward after such a rise in anti-Semitism lead to the opposition imploding? The final stage of the dispute was about the principle of shadow ministers' collective responsibility and arguments about process. But just digging deeper, how strong was the divide between those who were invested heavily in the principle of freedom of speech versus those who gave priority to fighting hate and protecting the Jewish community? Or was the divide actually just political, that the Nationals were reacting to One Nation's poll spike?
Well, Michelle, it's hard to know exactly what motivated the Nationals here, and I'll allow them to provide answers relating to why they ultimately made the decisions they did. There's a range of contradictions in the pathway that led to where we got to. I mean, originally there were members of the Nationals who indicated that there wasn't proper process and that there was no agreement at Shadow Cabinet. But then subsequently, of course, as we know from at least one, if not all, of the resignation letters that Susan Lee received, it was pointed out that they could not abide by the Shadow Cabinet solidarity process, which implies that there was an agreement reached. Without going into those details, it is my belief that agreement was reached, and that is why those resignations were tendered. Look, the process was the wrong way round from the broad government side of things. They should have had consultation with not only the community but other parties of parliament before they did, as they commenced the drafting process, so we could deal with some of these concerns right up front. We know drafters, and of course I know my colleagues and myself all worked through Christmas on these issues trying to get the right outcome. We would have been very happy to be a part of that. So the rushed, truncated process, a product of the nature of the events, was unfortunate, but it was what it was. And my belief is that we had to do the right thing by the Australian community. Are these laws a fix-all? No, they are part of the solution, and we did get rid of the incredibly insidious parts that a number of my colleagues had issues with, namely the racial vilification laws and the religious text defence. But I think that insofar as some of the major residual concerns, it was just unknowns and unintended consequences that may flow. And for the Nats' part, they just weren't satisfied, despite efforts that we went to try and satisfy them. So it's unfortunate. I think it could have been handled better. I'm disappointed in the approach the Nationals have taken. But here we are today, and we've just got to get on with it.
On the legislation itself, there's been obviously a big backlash from some of your base, some of the Liberal base. How confident are you that it has adequate guardrails? And I'll point out again here that you're on the Conservative wing of the Liberals, so presumably you're fairly eagle-eyed when it comes to things like guardrails.
Yeah, and that was important, and getting that balance right between freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and being able to stamp out insidious things like Islamic extremism, which is a driver for anti-Semitism, was very important and a difficult thing to do in such a short time frame. But the first victory was in the government backing down on their racial vilification laws, which would have been an incredible imposition on freedom of speech. I conducted a forum last night with thousands of members of the Australian Christian Lobby, a group who have been fairly prolific in their communication with me about their concerns relating to the legislation. One thing that's become apparent to me, Michelle, over the course of the last 3 weeks is that there are a huge number of social media influencers who seem more interested in boosting their algorithm and boosting their subscribers or viewer numbers than they are in facilitating passage of true information. And that is something that is very concerning to me. When you've got people suggesting that political parties like One Nation might end up as a hate group, which is just patently false, and we can step through how a hate group is determined, or pro-life activists protesting outside an abortion clinic. I mean, it's just nuts. But yet there are people out there spreading this stuff through their 30-second videos. And of course, it has whipped up this frenzy. And so every time I do a forum, every time I have a discussion, every time I respond to an email, it's amazing the number of people that come back and say, oh, thank you for that. Having read the laws in and out, back to front, read it in conjunction with the criminal code and the state laws that it relates to, I have every faith that there are adequate guardrails there, and this is not the attack on freedom of speech that some in the community are portraying it is.
Just tell us briefly the main guardrails.
Well, with regard to a hate crime, it's fairly clear, Michelle, in the legislation. It's clearly specified the elements of what constitutes a hate crime, which is what's required to have been proven in order for a hate group then to be listed. And the hate crime has these specific elements relating to it of a criminal nature. And indeed, Michelle Rowland, in her second reading speech, was very clear that it must be serious harm to a criminal standard under the current law. That is the criminal code. Laws that were not being amended apart from the penalties that applied to certain people. And just for example, Michelle, the provisions of the criminal code relate to things like advocating for force or violence against groups, advocating for damage or destruction to real property or motor vehicles, advocating for genocide. So you've got these provisions in the criminal code that go to courses of action. And as you know, under criminal law, you must demonstrate intent in order to be found guilty of a criminal charge, I should say. Then, of course, once found guilty under these existing laws, that then gives rise to, if you're part of a group, then the hate group provisions as defined under this new Section 114 about the advocating of certain activity, targeting groups based on racial or ethnic or national origin. This is not about all of the other attributes. You have the advice from the Director General of ASIO, where he must be satisfied of it's a two-limb test of very high thresholds around the nature of threat to promote political or communal violence, which is specified in the ASIO Act 1979. Then, of course, you've got the process of listing, which is by disallowable instruments. So either House of Parliament, not both, either can disallow that instrument. And of course, it's all reviewed by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Security and Intelligence. So there are a range of safety measures there, including the very high thresholds contained in criminal law, the very high thresholds contained in the bill that was passed, the very high thresholds in the ASIO Act, and then, of course, the democratic processes through disallowable instruments and parliamentary review through the Intelligence Committee.
Now, you mentioned that more needs to be done to combat this problem of anti-Semitism. What do you think needs to be done? And what was your reaction, incidentally, to the report this week that a Jewish victim who was injured in the Bondi massacre had her name changed in a Sydney hospital, in a hospital in Western Sydney, allegedly for her protection? And we do get reports of Jewish people in some areas feeling nervous about going into hospitals. What's your take on this?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a disturbing turn of events, and whether or not the individual in question had asked for such anonymity or a pseudonym to be provided that protection or not.
She says she didn't.
Yeah, so look, it is a sad state of affairs in our country where people think either themselves, they have to do it for themselves to continue to hide an identity. And of course, we did see those nurse practitioners who frankly outed themselves as anti-Semites in the last year, talking about how they would treat Jewish patients if they were presented to them. So you can understand some of the concerns around that. If the individual in question, the woman who had her name changed, didn't want that, I would question how on earth it then proceeded that a name change occurred without the individual's consent or even request. But I suppose it does rather point to this problem that these laws, in part, are supposed to deal with. And you allude to it in your question. More does need to be done to stamp out anti-Semitism. These laws go only so far and deal with some of the issues that have been bubbling away for the last 2 years, and we've had delayed response to by way of government and this legislation. I think there are other things that we need to look at, of course, how in our education system we ensure that we do have an approach to real tolerance. It's great to have Harmony Week, but how do we have a proliferation of anti-Semitism in certain parts of our community if we're a country that notionally celebrates things like multiculturalism and Harmony Week? So there are a range of things outside of just changing laws, increasing penalties, and the like that need to happen. And indeed, our conduct as leaders is an important part of that. Calling it out when we see it is probably a good start. And for the last 2 years, sadly, Michelle, I don't think that happened well enough.
Scott Morrison's come up with a fairly radical plan. He says the government should have stricter oversight of the teaching of Islam, including a recognised accreditation system for imams, a national register for public-facing religious roles, and clear training and conduct requirements. Do you think this sort of plan should be considered?
Look, I'm with the detail I've been able to glean from what's been said about this proposal. I mean, I'm always willing to have a look at anything that's put forward, but I immediately wonder if we're going to be putting in place a registration scheme for preachers or religious leaders of a particular faith, are we going to do it for everyone? I'm a firm believer in less government, less law, less regulation, and more common sense and people just doing the right thing. Sadly, that isn't always the case. But I'm very worried about the idea that the state would regulate who can and who can't preach in any faith. Who determines who gets a registration? Who designs the scheme that accredits a potential preacher of not just the Islamic but any other faith? So I think there are a range of concerns that present to me that would arise out of the setting up of such a scheme, and I'm not sure that it is the answer to the problem here. I do think that there is work to be done with regard to how we do deal with what has become an issue in our society, and I think having a stronger values-based component in our migration system is an important part to that. This is not about dictating to people what religion they have, how they vote, but indeed dictating to people that they are here to abide by what is good about Australian society, respect and tolerance of other people's religions and views and political affiliations, respect for the rule of law, respect for our democratic institutions. We have an Australian values statement that currently does cover off on all of those things. People sign it, but there is absolutely no penalty when you go back on that document you've signed and undercut that, undermine that, and don't abide by what's contained in it.
Of course, measuring values or assessing values is both hard and subjective, isn't it? And people can just sign a statement, as you say, saying they believe in all these things, and their conduct, even if it doesn't break the law, can be very different. So how do you actually measure values or assess values better?
Well, I think the Australian values statement, as set out, both for people who are applying for a visa of various categories in this country, but also the oath or affirmation that people take when they take the citizenship pledge, our various citizenship ceremonies, sets it out well enough. There are criminal penalties for certain things. There are electoral offences, of course. I don't think it would be beyond us if we could come together and, through the course of just a couple of weeks, come up with laws to try and deal with anti-Semitism and Islamic extremism in this country. I don't think it's impossible for lawmakers and legal academics and people who know a thing or two about structuring laws to come up with an approach to putting more teeth in what is currently just a statement people sign with no penalty for non-compliance for visa holders. So there are ways of doing it. I think it would be foolish for me to try and design it here on our discussion today, during this discussion today, but it is something I will be turning my mind to, of course, in my role as Shadow Minister for Home Affairs.
And of course, that role gives you broad oversight of the opposition's immigration policy, which we were promised before Christmas, and we're now getting to February, still no sign of it. When will we see it, and how precise in terms of numbers is it likely to be?
Well, our intention was to, of course, have the policy released for public consumption and the framework and principles contained in it certainly before Christmas. Obviously, the tragic events that led to us meeting as a parliament, legislating in the way we did, delayed that. That work has not been forgotten. It's not been shelved and put away. We will do some further work, some more refinements, and in the near future, the opposition will announce our policy when it comes to immigration. In terms of specific numbers, the numbers that would apply at the first opportunity for us to take back government, which is in 2028, will be different to the numbers that we can deduce today. There are so many factors and variables that go into the setting of numbers. Not even the government can predict what the numbers will be for next year. They've given up on multi-year planning, and so we do have this year-by-year approach, which is, I believe, ineffective. So we will take the time to get that right. We will lay down our framework and how we will reach the numbers that we seek to reach, and they are very basic principles we've given voice to in the past around understanding how many houses are going to be built across Australia over the next 12 or 24 months, or how much capacity there is in our public health system, particularly in major population centres, to provide healthcare to those we are bringing into this country. Can our education systems cope, and to what extent, and so on and so forth. It's not rocket science, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate these things. We will be working through all of those elements of consideration, and as a result, well before the election, we will be able to tell voters what immigration under the Liberals would look like in terms of numbers. But sooner than that, they will have a clear picture of how we would reach those numbers, and we'll take them on the journey with us as we bring together that policy and make sure that they understand what it means for them and how much better for the country it will be.
Now, turning back to the breakup of the coalition, how damaging is this split? And do you think it will be a short-term or a long-term divorce? And will reunification hinge on a change of Liberal leadership?
Well, I think it is probably a good thing for the Liberals and the Nationals to have time apart. I think that the Nationals have a range of issues they need to work through internally. Some of those were on display for all to see in the last sitting week, as they couldn't agree amongst themselves on their position on legislation. and various elements of those bills. And let's not forget, it's the second time in 12 months that the Nationals have precipitated a separation of this nature. I think it's important for the Australian community that we have a coherent opposition. When the Nationals are willing to be a part of such a coherent opposition, then I think it would be great to have them back. But at this point in time, I don't think they are. I don't think it does hinge on the leadership of the Liberals. And there's a lot of commentary out there about who may or may not want to challenge, whether indeed there is a challenge or not. I might also note that I've just seen on television now that Colin Boyce has indicated that he's going to call for a National Party room to spill the leadership, and he's putting his hand up as leader. So that could indeed change things as well. But my firm belief, Michelle, is that we should be taking our time to get this right. We don't need to rush back into coalition. Yes, that's a lot more work for every single Liberal member of Parliament when it comes to chamber duty, when it comes to shadow ministerial responsibilities, when it comes to holding the government to account. But we have to be up to it. We were left with no choice. And until the Nats want to come to their senses, this is the environment we'll be operating in.
Is it possible the split could continue to the election and you could run separately at the election? In other words, Liberals could challenge in national seats?
Well, indeed, that is a possibility. And I'm not going to predict anything here, but on the current course we're on, that's what's going to happen.
And that doesn't worry you?
Look, I'd rather be in coalition with them, but it's impossible to be in coalition with a group of people that have made the decision that they have and seem to offer no pathway back to coalition under current circumstances. It's for our party room to determine who our leader is. We have Susan Lee as our leader, and it's not going to be Nationals members unless they want to come and join the Liberal Party who will determine that. And indeed, they've had a very significant say over coalition policy, and rightly so. But if they want to exclude themselves from that process, then that is a matter for them. It's disappointing and I think unproductive, and it does make things in certain electorates far more challenging. But the ball's in their court, and if they wish to come back, then come and have a conversation with us.
You sound quite a hard-liner about your country cousins.
Well, I again, the facts are the facts. I was pretty closely involved with the process that we as an opposition went through in the lead up to the sitting week and through the sitting week, I might add. Every effort were made. If it were humanly possible to bend over backward to accommodate some of the changes that were requested, then that's what we were doing. It's certainly what I was doing. And so it was an incredibly disappointing turn of events for them to go the way they did. But again, that's a matter for them. They've made that decision, and until they want to revisit on that and explain to the world why they made those decisions in full honesty, then we're in this situation and I don't see it changing.
The rise of One Nation that we're seeing in many polls now affects both the Liberal vote as well as the Nationals vote. How concerned are you about this broader splintering on the right?
Well, I think there's a job for us in centre-right parties to certainly call out parties that have been all care and no responsibility, and they are minor parties. They can say whatever they like and vote however they do in Parliament with no regard for some of the bigger problems that come along for parties of government. We need to be clearer in our communication. We need to be clearer in making sure people understand what it is we stand for. And I take responsibility for this as well. I don't think we've done a very good job with that, not just in the last 9 or whatever months it's been since the election, but the last term too. That's why we're in opposition. That's why we got smashed at the last election. So that is a massive area of improvement for us. And when we're clear, when we're coherent, when we don't have equivocation in the things we say in the media, then what inevitably happens is people return to us with confidence. They will again trust us with their vote, and we push minor parties back into the margins, and we can again properly be an opposition and a party of government that is worthy of a vote of the Australian people. We've got work to do, and that's the goal.
But is a major reason why you're not clear, at least you're not clear since the election, the fact that you don't really know as a party what you now stand for. You're divided between those who have one set of values and priorities and those who have quite different values and priorities. Isn't that the fundamental problem, that John Howard's broad church has splintered into a whole lot of smaller denominations?
The rebirth process after a difficult election loss is always an unpleasant one and very unattractive, and it does not instill confidence in voters. And I think that's the only way I can explain the process we're going through now. And hence, perhaps not that we are poll watchers, but, the polls haven't changed since the election in any positive way. So we have significant work to do, and I think that is all of us in shadow cabinet, from the leader down, to ensure that we do operate with conviction and we do it clearly so people understand where we stand and what we stand for. It isn't helped by the phenomenon of some in the social media influencer sphere, as I say. A great example is frankly, the falsehoods that have been peddled about these hate laws by individuals online with massive followings, all pointing people to vote for One Nation based on falsehoods. And that is a concerning trend, and that is something we need to combat. And I'll continue to highlight to Australians in very factual and level-headed terms why we did what we did and why it isn't the problem that some of these out there to our right are saying it is. It's not a destruction of our freedom of speech rights in this country, far from it. So, look, it's a complex set of problems that require simple solutions, but we've just got to get about it and get on with the job and do it, Michelle.
But how do you bridge this gulf between the hardline Conservatives in your party and the moderates?
Well, it's funny. I think we have been able to do that quite a lot, and it's lost in the froth and bubble of everything that's going on at the moment. I mean, let's look at the last 6 months. Susan Lee was able to settle a net zero position where the moderates, as they're called, while they might have had concerns and issues with particular elements of what we were doing, they came along. They didn't leave the party. They haven't sat on the crossbench. Was everyone over the moon about the end outcome? No, but Susan was able to actually land that position. Let's have a look at the last week, of course. Both elements of the legislation, the firearms laws. Again, there were certain moderates that would have preferred to vote for the laws, along with the government and some of the minor parties. But our party position, both Conservative and moderate, was to vote against it for a range of reasons, despite there being contained in that legislation some very reasonable elements. But we weren't going to be trapped by the wedge politics. So again, Conservatives and moderates were able to come together. And then finally, on the hate laws, with the exception of, I believe, only one floor crossing in our parliament from the Liberals, Conservative and moderate members of the Liberal Party room all voted together for the laws as they finally presented to Parliament with the amendments we secured. So I don't think there is quite the gulf. What we do need to do is clearly tell people what we stand for and why, and how much better off they will be as a result of that. I think we can happily work Conservative and moderate in our party, because at the end of the day, we're all Liberals and we all want the best for our country.
Well, to a degree there you paint a quite optimistic picture, and yet, as we know, Susan Lee's leadership is hanging by a thread. Hardly anyone thinks she will survive, even in the medium term. Will a change of leader be needed? What is your position on the leadership, and will we see a change next week, in a few weeks, or further on?
Look, I mean, these are always unattractive discussions that occur, and I think when you consider the number of unnamed sources and unattributed comments that appear in the paper, yet no one has said there's a leadership challenge on. I'm not aware of any meeting being called or indeed any challenge being mounted. it's all, frankly, at this point in time, much ado about nothing, and precipitated, I think, largely by, sadly, the events of the last week. We just have to get on, as I intend to. I mean, we've just talked about the need for us to deliver on a promise we made last year, which is now overdue because of extenuating circumstances, and that is delivering our migration policy. We just got to get on and do that stuff. We've got to be in opposition for the people of Australia, because a government is only as good as its opposition. At this point in time, we're spending a bit too much time talking about ourselves and not the people of Australia. So the sooner that settles down, the better.
But to be blunt, we both know it's not going to settle until this leadership question is resolved. And I don't think many people would agree that this is much to do about nothing. It really is simply an issue that is being brought to the surface more and more each day, is it not? It has to be resolved quickly.
So, yeah, of course, I'd be foolish and dishonest if I did not say that the ongoing commentary around Liberal Party leadership was unhelpful. And it's not helpful. It is taking us away from our main job. So, yeah, to that end, absolutely it needs to be resolved. Does that mean that we must have a leadership ballot? Or does that mean we need to have those who are being spoken about indicate their intent one way or another? I mean, those are things beyond my control. At this point in time, there is no spill on. There is no party room meeting that's been called for. And so that's why I perhaps flippantly suggest it's much ado about nothing. But yes, I accept your point. It does need to be resolved, and God willing, it will be resolved, and our party can just, as it has when we've experienced these issues before, just get on and do our job after the matter is resolved.
And you're in the change column?
Well, this is not about me being in the change column or not, because, again, I've just given you a range of examples of Susan Lee's leadership having united our party. You rightly point out that there are conservative and moderate elements to our party, and she has, and I want to underscore, with the net zero landing that Susan Lee presided over, yeah, there were a lot of people working on that. Let's not forget how many Liberal and coalition leaders have been chewed up and spat out by climate politics in this country and our position on it over the last 10 or 15 years. She survived that. And so to that end, I'm not going to sit here today and say, yep, we've got to have a change. What we need to have is a resolution to this ongoing public debate around whether or not there should be a leader or a change or not. I am not putting my hand up for leadership. I'm not one of those parties. I think we just need to bring a resolution to this so we can get on with the job.
Now, as we speak today, we still don't have the new all-Liberal shadow ministry. When that comes, do you expect to remain in the Home Affairs shadow portfolio, and do you want to remain in that job?
Well, look, that's a matter for the leader as to what roles her or her team perform in, and I'm honoured to have this portfolio, obviously coming into it, an area of policy that I'd not had much experience in. It has been a baptism of fire, and it has been, as they say, like drinking from a fire hydrant, to consume all of the detail and data, get one's head around how national security works in this country, the functions of those agencies, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and the rest of us. But it is something I certainly have put effort into. I do enjoy doing. And if I'm asked to stay on in this role or another, or indeed to serve on the backbench, then that is the leader's prerogative, and I will happily serve however I am invited to do.
I think given the numbers, almost no one will serve on the backbench anymore. Jonathan Duniam, thank you very much for talking with us today in, as the old proverb goes, very interesting times for the Liberal Party. That's all for today's Politics podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.